Friends, a soldier whose love had crashed in a snowy area now had to face dangerous videos and Germans who were constantly after his life. The story begins with us being shown a Russian pilot named Charles who was currently on his leave. Charles was on his way when he met a woman being harassed by some men. Without wasting any time, Charles went to save the woman. But by then, the thugs had taken all her money and food. Charles comforted her, but he had no idea how important she would become for him later. Months passed, and Charles returned to his pilot job. The year was 1947. Charles worked for the Russian military, and he and his team were attacking Germans infiltrating the border. Charles was the best pilot in his team, and along with his friend John, they continuously attacked the Germans, destroying many German tanks with great bravery. However, soon many German planes attacked them. 2 planes from Charles's team were destroyed, and the Germans kept attacking Charles's plane. Although Charles's plane, for O1, was giving a tough fight, its fuel tank began leaking, meaning it couldn't stay airborne for long. Charles and his friend John tried to land the plane in a safe place, but the entire area was controlled by the Germans. The Germans knew Charles was about to land, so they sent their soldiers to capture Charles and John. Charles and John managed to land the plane cautiously, but the Germans followed them and started firing from all directions. In the crash landing, Charles becomes completely unconscious. To save Charles, John carries him on his shoulders and starts running. The German soldiers continue to chase them. John reaches the edge of an icy river and quickly places Charles on a piece of ice, sending him floating down the river. John himself runs into the forest. After some time, gunfire is heard from the forest, indicating that the Germans have killed John. When Charles regains consciousness, he finds himself in the middle of the water, but the Germans spot him and start firing at him. With great difficulty, Charles reaches the other side of the river and immediately runs into the forest to save his life. Although he manages to escape the German soldiers for a while, the cold is extreme. Charles has to somehow light a fire and decides to spend the night there. In this short time, Charles's condition deteriorates significantly, and while escaping from the Germans, he also got a wound on his leg. If this wound is not treated properly, it will gradually become infected. After several hours, Charles starts to lose consciousness again. He recalls his past, remembering when he met Kalia. Despite the difficult time, thinking about Kalia makes him happy. After spending one night in the snowy forest, Charles begins to move forward. Due to the wound, he can barely walk, and the thick layer of snow makes every step difficult. Despite this, Charles keeps moving forward, knowing he has to somehow reach the Russian camp. If the Germans capture him, they will give him a fate worse than death. With great courage, Charles continues to move. He starts eating leaves from the trees to satisfy his hunger. Despite all these hardships, Charles keeps moving forward. After another nightfall, Charles set up a campfire and stayed in the forest. But then, wild wolves surrounded him, constantly approaching to eat him. At that moment, Charles remembered he had a gun. Using it, he managed to scare the wolves away. Although the immediate threat was gone, Charles couldn't sleep all night. When morning came, Charles started moving again, but the dangerous wolves were still following him, intent on eating him. With very few bullets left, Charles didn't waste them and ran deeper into the forest. The wolves got closer and closer. Charles reached a point where the German military base started. If he went any further, the Germans would capture him. Charles thought this might be his end. Just then, the Russians attacked the German military base with explosions and gunfire all around. The blast scared the wolves away, giving Charles a brief respite. Charles found a hiding spot in the forest. The Germans continued searching for him, having already killed several resistance soldiers. Charles was lost in thought, unconscious, with only memories of Kalia on his mind. He had spent good times with Kalia before embarking on this mission, even though they didn't have much time together. Charles had grown to love Kalia deeply and had promised to marry her after the mission. However, given the current situation, it seemed unlikely Charles would survive. Still, without much thought, he started moving again to save his life. After walking for so long, he was exhausted, and the wound on his leg had completely festered. In this condition, Charles could barely walk, but he had to save his life, so he kept moving forward. Once again, a new threat appeared. The pack of dangerous wolves that had been chasing him. Charles could barely walk properly, so he limped along. After a short while, he fell into a pit. Fortunately, the wolves didn't follow him into the pit, which meant the pit saved his life. However, this relief didn't last long. A hungry wolf jumped into the pit and started attacking Charles with its sharp teeth. Charles struggled hard to save himself but failed repeatedly. In desperation, Charles grabbed a piece of wood lying nearby and stabbed the wolf, killing it. Although he saved his life, he was so injured that he lost consciousness. A while later, when Charles opened his eyes, he found a German man taking him to his home to treat his injuries. The man had hidden Charles under a stack of hay to prevent the German soldiers from finding him. Though he was German, the man was a compassionate human first and foremost. Seeing Charles in such a critical condition, he decided to help him and took him home to nurse him back to health. The German man hid Charles in his storeroom because if the German soldiers found Charles, they would kill him. However, the German military became suspicious of this man and soon arrived at his house to investigate. The soldiers searched the entire house for Charles. Meanwhile, the German man arranged for two of his people to take Charles far away from there. The two men carried Charles through the forest, moving deeper to ensure his safety. After thoroughly investigating, the military discovered that the German man had helped Charles. As a result, they set the man's house on fire and killed him for aiding their enemy. However, the two men carrying Charles had already traveled a great distance. The German military spread out through the forest to find Charles. The two men continued to carry Charles, but the German soldiers were closing in. One of the men panicked and abandoned Charles, fleeing the scene. The other man stayed with Charles, but soon the German soldiers arrived. As a soldier approached to check if Charles was alive, Charles suddenly regained consciousness and shot the soldier, killing him. The remaining German man still wanted to help Charles, so he continued to move towards the Russian military. The Germans were still pursuing them. The man dragged Charles to a battleground where the Germans and Russians were fighting each other. The German man decided to drag Charles into the Russian camp to hand him over safely. As they reached the Russian bunker, the German man planned to leave. However, a firefight broke out between the Germans and Russians, and the German man who had helped Charles was killed in the explosions. After enduring so many hardships, Charles finally reached the Russian camp safely and was taken to a hospital for treatment. Charles opened his eyes 2 days later. Although he had survived, he was devastated to learn that both his legs had been amputated. He couldn't understand how he would manage without his legs and felt overwhelmed with despair. But now, Charles had to spend his life in this condition. He wasn't writing letters to Kalia because he felt he was no longer worthy of her and wondered why Kalia would marry him now. These thoughts left Charles hollow inside. Months passed by with these thoughts weighing on his mind. One day, a concert was being prepared in front of the hospital, featuring various singers from the city. Kalia was among the performers. One by one, the singers gave their performances. Charles had been given artificial legs to walk, but he still struggled to use them properly. As soon as Kalia started singing at the concert, Charles recognized her voice. He immediately tried to reach the window, stumbling as he went, because everyone in the hospital was busy watching the concert. Somehow, Charles managed to reach the window. Seeing Kalia perform after so long made him very happy, but he didn't call out to her because he didn't want her to see him in this condition. Charles resigned himself to living his life without Kalia. And so our story ends here.